Hello, this is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune. This is a new podcast in our ongoing series Basic Notions of Metaphysics, and this time around we'll talk about term that I will first pronounce in its original Greek, hypostasis. The reason why I use the Greek term out of the bat is because it is more often than not left untranslated, because its meanings, as with all metaphysical notions, are various. There is a basic meaning, or we'll talk about it in a moment, and there is no really, let's say, 100% certain translation of what the hypostasis means, and even the Latin thinkers of the Middle Ages, traditional thinkers that use this word very often, not always, but often left it untranslated when they are talking about very specific meanings of hypostasis. Now, it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. This podcast is not something that should be understood as an exhaustive interpretation of metaphysical notions. This is something to especially accentuate when we talk about hypostasis, because the implication of this term and its historical influence could not be underestimated, and I don't consider myself capable to give some kind of definite account on hypostasis. The other methodological remark I'll make here is that I will be talking about Christian understanding of this term, and because I do believe that Christian theological and metaphysical application of the term is the most perfect, the most clear, but it is not the only one, and it is not the original one. I would say about the concerning the origin of the word, as far as I know, the technical use of the word hypostasis comes from Stoic medicine. It was used in medicine. It had this medical aspect. In philosophy, it is very much used in Neoplatonism, especially in Plotinus. Plotinus made a big use of the word hypostasis, and a lot of people who study philosophy first hear about hypostasis in Greek, not, for instance, subsistentias or even substantias in Latin possible translations, or uses words that can be used to denote or express what hypostasis means, usually first run into Plotinus. We won't talk about him here. We'll try to depict what hypostasis is from the hypostasis itself. And so this gives us ground to say something about the third methodological, let's say, methodological rule in this kind of philosophy. All those basic notions are very simple notions, but this means that they are very profound also. So we can approach them relatively, let's say, without some great knowledge of the history of ideas, or the history of how these principles, understanding of these principles developed, and use our everyday notions, because this is where they come from. Maybe not always from everyday notions, because when you speak of hypostasis of Father, or hypostasis of Son, well, more of, maybe to a largest extent, to the hypostasis of the Holy Spirit, those are really not hypostasis you'll see every day. But the term itself comes from, can be observed in everyday living, and this is very important. And this is the purpose of this series of podcasts, anyway. Now, when we put that out of the way, we'll try to give a translation of hypostasis. It would be self-subsisting, unique, and incommunicable reality. I'll repeat, self-subsistent, unique, and self-subsistent can mean to an extent independent, and incommunicable reality. And this is very important. I think that these vectors, or better to say, this determination of the expression hypostasis, give us a clue. Very good, not more than a clue to understand it. By the way, the Greek word would mean almost literal, I would say, substantia, or something that hypo is under. Stasis is, let's say, standing or being put, or very multi-meaning word, but something that has it associates, in fact, which is often the case in ancient Greek, to an image of something that is kind of like foundation, or something that you can stand on. But the meaning is far more profound than just that. Just to give a cursory explanation of a cursory translation of the Greek word. It's very hard to. It's interesting. You can use it properly, and when somebody asks you what it means, you cannot give account. And this is also a quality of basic metaphysical notions. Very interesting thing. But we'll try to clarify it somewhat. So, to explain this definition we just gave of the term hypostasis, we'll call upon Aristotle, who doesn't use it in the context I'll just introduce, but he means it, I think. And that's from his work Categories, Categoria. That is the work about basic expressions about, or even basic expressions of beings in language. So the simploque legomenas, he says, things said in a simple, in non-complex way. So the basic things that can be said, and also completely congenially and undividedly, the basic modes, the things, material, not only in material world, the things that can be spoken are existing. So the prime category is that which is a subject, which we perceive in language as a subject of the sentence, that to which everything is predicated, or everything is said of, as Aristotle would say. We have to be careful, because these predications, signifiers and such, that can be to an extent anachronisms. He says things said, something that is always spoken of, but is never spoken itself, in the sense that it is never spoken about something. That is to say, in modern terms, not predicated or something. So this is what he calls proteusia. That is to say, first, let's say, substance. Unfortunately, I can't find better English word. We have, I would use preferably Croatian translation of ousia, bivstvo, but I can't, because nobody will understand, and I would have to explain it. The second instance of this primary category is what he calls deuterousia, or second substantiality, even better term would be, that is the species or genera of things. That is to say, if I am proteusia, and I am the first hypostasis, the first substance in language, that is to say, a concrete existing man with a name, surname, and so on, but doesn't have to, in this context, doesn't have to be a man. That could be a table or chair or emotion or something like that. Anything that is, because thinking here is not confined to matter, it is confined to finitude. This is very different than we think today. So You can talk about emotions to an extent. In a same sense, you can talk about, for instance, of material things. So I would be there, because when you say Branko is human being, you are predicating this second substantiality to me. You are putting me in the species and genera, giving a definition. But definition is always, in the primary sense, about this particular one being, not about species and so on. And this is very interesting. We'll talk a bit about the implications of this as much as we can, because this is a very broad subject and profound, which is a very difficult combination. We have to understand that speaking in this sense doesn't mean that these terms, first substantiality, second substantiality, and hypostasis, are absolute in this sense. In the sense that, for instance, this particular individual, man, is always to be understood as hypostasis, towards which everything else, all first substantiality. Not exactly, because in the world, a finite world, there is not an absolute meaning, absolute being, or an absolute expression thereof. So when observed from a different perspective, from the perspective of other beings, for instance, it can be understood to not be first substance, because something is more substantial than it. I won't go too much into this. This is also a methodological remark, because this is what you have in these ancient philosophers and medieval philosophers, and this is why they don't have systems, and why people who try to impose the system upon their thinking are wrong, because they couldn't fathom the idea that you could have a closed explanation of the world that is, in a sense, bigger than you. They were thinking from the principles that were metaphysical, but they were never eager to give account of everything, to fix the definite meaning in a kind of system that could be even to write a book that explains everything in the world. The thinking is an activity, and acts of thinking are actual acts. System is nothing like that. System is a closed whole made of, let's say, sentences or rules or even laws that kind of like closes everything in itself, in its in fact artificial subjective form. Nothing like that is at work here. So let us keep this in mind. So Aristotle gave us one basis to talk about hypostasis. The term was later developed, especially for Western tradition, or I would say even for the whole of metaphysical tradition and theological tradition afterwards, by Boethius, who translated it. Subsistence, or translated it for use, to use it in a context of persona, something that was in the Greek prosopon. For instance, John of Damascus uses the word prosopon for person, where we have a very special mode of hypostasis, and really what interests us here, that is to say, hypostasis as a person. Now, when talking about this Aristotle's definition of first substantiality, or first beings, in the sense of first that we can that come first in our language, when we talk about it, we are compelled to understand everything through. I used the example of myself, but what is important, I used the example of man, of human being that is individual. Today, individual human being we'll call a person. Interestingly enough, to put things back to the strict level, in our European Union, especially in English language countries, I noticed that person is much more used than man or woman. That it is a preferred term to denote somebody as opposed to something. Although this is more often than not now used even for animals, which is completely, as we'll see, completely unwarranted. However, term person, there is a basis for this to some extent, because person as hypostasis is the self-subsisting, unique, and incommunicable reality endowed with intellect. That is to say, intellectual. That is to say, capable of knowing and capable of reflecting into itself, which is most important existential aspect of this being. This is person. As such, it has a quite specific meaning. Now, our usual understanding of person and meaning of this word, or what person is that for some reason it has an absolute value. That is to say, the value of personhood transcends value of all other beings. What is rarely spoken of and what is rarely thought about or reflected upon is where we get this sense of this huge value of person. Well, I would posit boldly, considering the limited scope I imposed on myself in this podcast, that it comes from Christianity itself. That is to say, it is the basis of the Christian tradition, and basis of the Christian tradition as a revelation. Now, was person revealed to us? How come we never, people didn't have notion of person? Well, having notion of something and having reality of something is of course not the same thing. We can say that persons didn't exist pre-Christianity, especially people who study philosophy and who read, for instance, Apology, Plato's Apology of Socrates, Socrates' defense on court, will see a lot of this, what could pass to an unattentive reader for a modern day exemplar of defense of individual person. However, the Apology of Socrates is not really that. It is defense of much more, and in a sense much less than defense of an individual person. The understanding of human being that we get with this hypostatic understanding of person is something quite different. Hypostatic understanding of person, and I'm talking here to be more specific about human person, relies upon its being unique, that's one thing, and it being incommunicable, which is complementary, because incommunicable means that it cannot be transferred on another. Nobody can depersonalize you in an ontological sense. There is this term depersonalization when somebody goes into psychosis or is a subject of brainwashing and so on, but the idea is that deep down, that is to say, in the origin, a person cannot be annihilated. It can be hurt, it can be done injustice upon, but cannot really be annihilated and cannot really be blended with other persons. Person is something that is always separated from other persons by its uniqueness. This is something that is given to it. It is, on the other hand, conjoined with them, with the nature they share, and it is very important that understanding of person is something quite different than understanding any other being. Because understanding is an understanding of causes. And to understand the cause of person, to fully understand, for instance, why person acts as it acts, to go into somebody's mind and heart, is not something that is really possible to absolute degree. There is no chance of searching depths of person by intellectual effort. Not simply because intellect is incapable of this, but simply because the person is so unique to the one he or she is, that real content, real depths of it can be only glimpsed at time. Now, I don't subscribe to theory, and it's really theory in the modern sense of modern philosophy, of this analogical understanding, that people understand each other making analogies to others from themselves. So I am kind of like conjuring what you are thinking because I'm taking myself as an example. This would mean this is complete isolation. This is not being incommunicable. My essence or your essence being incommunicable, this means being totally isolated. There is indeed a connection between persons, and this connection can be deeper, shallower, better or worse, depending, in fact, in Christianity, depending on belonging to the same body that transcends the person. But we won't go into that. We'll leave that to some other time, maybe. What is very important is that understanding of person is not scientific understanding, not only in modern sense, but even in this traditional sense, where science is, for instance, syllogistical demonstration, which is extremely deep way of demonstrating something if done properly. And as I said, it is my understanding that this is something that is acquired first and foremost from understanding, attempted understanding of incarnation. Now we often get this question where you get this idea of Christianity being in the kernel of European civilization. Well, this is one of the parts where you really can find it, because this idea of an inviolability of person does not come from recognition of humanism, of the idea that human is something above other beings and so on, taken in himself. No, it comes from idea that God can be incarnated in person. The thing is that throughout the rather long history of the building of the Christian tradition and the clashes that paved this way towards a unity of doctrine or unity of tradition, it became clear that the only way to understand incarnation is hypostasis. That incarnation, that is to say, the unifying, the distinct unity or unique distinction of the human and divine nature, can come to pass only in hypostasis, in personal hypostasis. And this personal hypostasis is consequently Jesus Christ. Now, when I say this, I'm not saying principle, Christ the principle, Christ the intellect, or Christ the explanatory origin, or something like that. I'm talking about men with hair, with feet, with heart, with loves, with fears, with everything coming with him. This is hypostasis, personal hypostasis. Because never mind, I gave a definition of the personal hypostasis of person. Definition is not what a thing is. It is just conceiving of what it is. It is never expressing the reality completely. It is not the expression of reality, because the reality of hypostasis cannot be reduced to definitions or to abstractions, let's say. It is always real, and this comes first and foremost from the fact that it is defended by the God himself in Christian optics. Because once incarnation occurred, came to pass, let's say, when this event happened, this personal hypostasis of man is sanctified in a sense. And violation of it, be it cognitive, be it material violation, be it any kind of violation, is not merely sin against man or trespass against man, it is trespass against God. Because through this one, I will not go too deep into theology of this, but just basic elements of it. Through this act, the whole humankind is, let's say, re-sanctified, reinstated in the state of original manhood, of original man's nature, because the human and divine nature were conjoined in one person, and this person has a name and has to have name. This is what I want to stress, maybe somewhat roundabout way. It has to have name. It cannot be abstract incarnated God. So I always find it funny and to some extent annoying when people come with those mostly 19th century ideas of Christian doctrine of incarnation or revelation being some kind of copying of Indian or Egyptian myths and so on. First and foremost, those ideas get refuted very quickly, because when you get into details, you see that those correspondences with dates, for instance, with events that lead to conception of God and the birth of God are completely different. But the main difference is not in this. They get refuted, and they get reinvented again or repeated again, and then again somebody refutes them, and it goes in circles. So there is no point of going in circles when you see that the principle of incarnation, the principle of hypostasis as divine Bogo Čovjek, I don't know how you God man that's how you say it in English, is completely unique. I mean, first of all, it's civilization building, but it is unique in its being so explicit. Because when analyzed, and by analysis, as I always repeat, I don't mean chopping something to parts, but resolving or explicating what is implicated. All of those determinants of what this incarnation means are kind of laid bare. There is some kind of let's say, way marker. I don't know what word to use in English. English is so abstract sometimes. Some kind of indication what it should mean to us. That's what I mean. Fate or no fate. Let's take it just like a concept. Then when you resolve it, you see this. You see the implication of it. And something like that, I wouldn't say really existed before it or after it, although much similar myths you have in the East, for instance, both near and Far East. I don't think they apply. And to conclude with implications for our everyday life, or for historical moment or whatnot, this is, I would say, this implication is the inviolability of human person, which was not always understood as such, because when you see this identification of people with their city-states, for instance, in Greece, or with their ethnic religions, this was different understanding. I wouldn't go so far to give broad historical sweep like I am explaining the whole of pre-Christian antiquity. That's something the Germans used to do in 19th and early 20th century to, I think, very bad effect. But you cannot but notice the difference, especially, for instance, in philosophers. When you read Aristotle, and you see this difference in details, which are most profound differences, that this understanding of person is not really present, and that's why, for instance, there is almost no thought about slavery being something bad, or for instance, no thought about torture as a legal practice to be bad, or such things. I think that with Christianity we get this, and it is ironical to a huge extent that this notion was incorporated in legal systems, and that it is being dissolved now. It was first, of course, secularized, and then it's been dissolved. There is an image I very often use from that document on tolerance that was to be implemented as a policy guideline throughout Europe, and fortunately its creators didn't succeed in that. Where you have the images of people that are composed, faces that are composed of different faces. For instance, the eyes of a black man, the mouth of Japanese or Chinese or Asian, or ears of a European white guy, and so on, a white woman on the, for instance, mouth of the black man, and so on. This is, for instance, the complete violation. I mean, it is utmost attempt to dissolve a person, and you can kind of see in image what dissolution of person would entail, a Frankenstein monster of a kind. And this is, in my opinion, very important. And this is also the attack on the notion of hypostasis, because this is the notion that is one of the most important metaphysical notions, and assumption of its existence and reliance upon it in drawing any kind of conclusions or inferences is a must. Once you remove it from your thinking, you are literally losing ground under your feet. So you get things like this, and as I say, hypostasis implies a certain nature, and you cannot say that you can change hypostasis. Its uniqueness is not something that is just occurs, because uniqueness cannot just occur. if you think about it. Its uniqueness comes from it being created. In this, when I'm talking about humans now. It's being, interestingly enough, both identical and different from something else. Identical with itself, I mean. And for instance, that law policy document I was talking about, it was based on the assumption that all identity comes from difference. This is kind of like turning things around, because inverting things, because the first thing is that I am or you are, and difference is based upon this. So being incommunicable means that everybody is unique, but on the basis of being, not on the basis of other of being, non-being, or being different. Whereas in these postmodern, let's call them policy of dissolution theories and practices, this is inverted, and this is strictly attack on personal hypostasis. And ironically, of course, conservatives would rebel against this and wanted to reinstate the personhood or individual, the uniqueness and value of individual, without recourse to where this originates from, because it's too much to them to affirm that hypostasis is something that is created and that uniqueness is a consequence of creation. Conservatives, even Christian conservatives, don't want to go that far, but I think that the way they are trying to fight postmodernity, what modernity is doomed to failure. You cannot talk or write about these things without a great body of backing work, like having this is why footnotes exist in the books, and this is not for nothing, because you have to substantiate, big claims have to be substantiated in a big way. Although, as I said at the beginning, these notions are very simple and they are very accessible in a way, but accessible doesn't mean that once you accessed some understanding, basic understanding of them, which you can even without reading books, in my opinion, this doesn't mean that you came to the bottom of what they are, because coming to that would be something very big for one, very big achievement for one life. Anyway, thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune signing out.